It's World Obesity Day on Monday, and in South Africa, the death rate from non-communicable diseases has risen by over 60% between 1997 and 2018. According to research, 1 in 8 South African youngsters are thought to be overweight, which is significantly higher than average for the entire world. The food sector spends billions of rands annually to market its products to children. Coalition group Heala is pleading with government to swiftly raise the health promotion levy to 20% on certain types of sugar-sweetened beverages. Program manager at Heala, Petronella Kruger, joins us for this discussion. Petronella, appreciate your time. Let's start off with, what is the official definition of obesity?
Thank you so much, firstly, for having me. And the official definition of overweight and obesity relates to your body mass index. So currently, it's if you have a body mass index of 30 plus. And then there are different gradients of obesity. So you would have heard some of the less flattering terms called morbid obesity, and that would be some of sort of the classical depictions we've seen. So if you've watched the film The Whale, you'd have seen an example of that. But really, actually, I think a lot of people carrying around a few extra kilograms will be quite scared if they go to the doctor and find out that they actually are at risk of becoming obese in the medical context.
I just want to dwell on BMI a little bit, body mass index. Yeah. Is it a relative term? Because you'd find that there are some races that are big-boned, for instance, right? And then the others that are smaller. Does BMI take this into account?
So you go, firstly, just to say I'm not a medical doctor, but we've actually had this discussion a lot, just in the food space. Absolutely, and there's a very big concern with body mass index being a largely Western metric, and that it has sort of certain definitions that would then inherently cause certain cultural groups and races to be classed as higher than lower. The reason that BMI is still helpful, though, is because it tracks, or we use it to really track trends. So what we can see is, regardless of whether or not the scale isn't appropriately used for all groups, we can see if in any country there is a rise in weight versus length. So while absolutely there definitely is a lot of concerns that we have with body mass index, what it does help us to do, so for example, the statistics South Africa example you raised of non-communicable diseases, they also would track just overall overweight and obesity rates, and we see that in South Africa every few years that we'll have sort of a running study on that. What we can do is we can see if people are in the long term picking up a lot of weight, or if there's hunger and issues where there might be armed conflict, you can see population groups are dropping a lot of weight. Now, in that sense, it's quite helpful for us to use BMI just because it does indicate a trend. But what we do know is that non-communicable diseases, which is linked to body weight and overweight and obesity, has actually, in fact, increased quite significantly. And you were referring to the Lancet report, and really one of the reasons that we're tracking weight and overweight and obesity is because there is such a strong correlation. Generally, we believe that there's about 4 major reasons that would cause people to pick up too much weight, and that would be the diet, which is a really, really strong risk factor. And I've seen estimates as high as 6% of people in South Africa, and this was in 2014, die because of diseases related to poor diet. And then you have things like alcohol and tobacco use, and then also just general levels of physical activity.
So when we talk about diet, we're obviously talking about what people eat, but it varies between the good stuff and the bad stuff, right? Now, I imagine that there is some stuff that we assume is good stuff, but actually because we don't read the fine print, it isn't. So how much is that a contributor factor to obesity, where people think that they're eating proper food, but there is a problem with the actual food?
I mean, I would say that's probably the leading cause of why we're seeing such high rates and increases in overweight and obesity, because really our everyday diet has changed significantly. And it's called, academics will call it the nutrition transition, which is effectively where we see local, culturally appropriate, locally sourced fresh food being displaced with ultra-processed food or maximally processed food. Now, how do you, as an everyday person, know whether or not food is good or bad? The reality is that even if you are the most diligent consumer and you read the back of a pack, you're going to struggle to interpret it. I work in this space, and I am still constantly confuzzled by the amount of names used just for types of sugar. To get around that, what we really need is something that we've seen, for example, in Chile and in Argentina being introduced, which is called a front-of-pack label. And what it does is experts would calculate cutoff rates for when food starts becoming possibly dangerous for you or bad for your health. And then if a food meets certain criteria, on the front of the food, it has to carry a label that says, warning, this might contain too much trans fat, too much sugar, too much salt. The wonderful news is that in South Africa, the Department of Health has now proposed an evidence-based, South African-developed front-of-pack warning label, which we think is going to make a massive difference in people's ability to identify which food is healthy and which food is not healthy. And that is an important part of creating demand for healthy food. But I do want to reiterate that thinking that it's as simple for people to just start making different decisions and that they'll be able to then change their weight it's absolutely an oversimplification and not true. We really need to start thinking about food and our health in terms of systems. And a really simple example is you've heard a lot of people say, I want to go running at night, but I don't live in a city where it's safe. I'm concerned that I'll get murdered if I go for a jog at night. The same thing with food. There's more than 200 registered soda providers in South Africa. That's companies, not brands. But I challenge your viewers to think of more than 8 brands. And that's because what we eat really isn't fully within our control. We are at the mercy of where food suppliers are in our region, at our working hours, and what those food suppliers decide to stock. And then, of course, we all know that there's tons and tons of advertisements for food and unhealthy food that specifically target children. And anyone with kids would know that, especially if you drive on the N1 in Johannesburg, you'd see big, juicy pictures of hamburgers and fried chicken. And the kids in the car would then prompt mom and dad and say, wouldn't that be a lovely treat after school? So we need to think about this systemically and holistically, and we need to start thinking about it as South Africans in terms of demanding that food producers act ethically, so not advertise food in this unethical manner. And we need to start asking our government regulators to bring in appropriate interventions to make sure that healthy food is more affordable and unhealthy food is less accessible.
Absolutely.